Hi, this is Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D. Today I wanted to discuss something related to the subject of phenomenology. And the main thing I wanted to talk about were two basic concepts and then relate them to Maoism Third Worldism. The first is bracketing, and the second is intersubjectivity. Both of these have been used by a variety of different authors coming from a wide spectrum, a wide array of different backgrounds that have taken the ideas of Edmund Husserl and applied them to their own fields. Let me explain to you the basics, and I really mean the basics. In subsequent videos, I may get into these subjects in more detail, since my plan now is that after I finish my current book, Eudaimonic Utopia, my next book will deal with the subject of phenomenology and the relationship between phenomenology and Maoism, Third Worldism, as well as the critical realism of Roy Bhaskar. Two concepts. First, epiche, commonly translated as bracketing. The second, intersubjectivity. Now that's basically leaving out a lot of phenomenology. Now, Husserl did not coin the term phenomenology. The word phenomenology was already being used by Hegel in his book Phenomenology of Spirit, but the manner in which Husserl used it was considerably different and took on a unique flavor with his approach to phenomenology, and that is what I use. I personally have no interest in Hegel's phenomenology. Not that I find it defective, but it just does not really suit the purposes of what I'm trying to accomplish. Husserl's approach does. Husserl was basically trying to develop a new framework for human relationships. His idea was that all human interactions should be based upon love, should be based upon the meeting of the minds and the meeting of the hearts. That's intersubjectivity. But before you can begin to practice intersubjectivity, you have to practice what Husserl calls epiche, or bracketing. Epiche, or bracketing, as I define it, is to set aside all of your prejudices, all of your preconceptions, to ignore the outside world, to ignore the background of the person you are speaking with, to ignore the personal characteristics, if you know about them, of the person you are speaking with. In other words, to forget all that you think you know about that person. In many cases, we may think that we understand a person, but we really don't. Or if we understand that person, it may only be on a very superficial level. So what Husserl basically said is, just throw all that stuff out. Throw out all the junk. Just toss it into the trash and look only at the heart and the intuition of that person, meaning the love and the inner vision of that person. That's really all that ultimately counts. Okay, so you bracket what does not matter, and you connect intersubjectively with what does matter. That is the very basic outline of Husserl's phenomenology. Now, what does that mean? That means that all of a sudden, I can relate to people as they really are. Because how somebody looks, what they believe, what they think, their conditioning, their socialization, anything that is not directly connected with that person's inner self is kind of irrelevant. It has no direct bearing on how I, as an individual, can relate to that individual. Ideally, not only should I be practicing intersubjectivity, but the other person should be doing it as well. However, in reality, it's really not realistic to expect that. In most cases, it'll only be me or you doing the intersubjectivity. The other person will not really understand it. Now, if you have time to explain it sufficiently, if the other person is willing, that would, I think, even enhance the phenomenological experience further. But don't depend upon it. Just think about yourself and how you relate directly to that person. Now, I once thought about the concept of mind melding as it is used by the Vulcans in Gene Roddenberry's Star Trek. And Mr. Spock used to do it all the time. Is there a similarity between intersubjectivity and Vulcan mind melding? Well, one thing that I noticed when I watched Spock and other Vulcans, fictional Vulcans, doing the mind melding, they would get into a kind of emotional state. Now, if you know anything about the Vulcans, they are not emotional. At least they try to suppress their emotions. Now, throughout the many different episodes of Star Trek, throughout the many different Star Trek series, the nature of mind melds changed. Different writers had their own takes on it, and so there really is no consistent definition of what a mind meld is, but it is a kind of emotional condition in which one does try to connect with the other person. So I would say yes, to a limited extent, there is some connection with Vulcan mind melds. If you have ever watched any of the episodes of the original Star Trek and some of the follow-up sequels to Star Trek, which also had Vulcans in it, you would have probably seen people engaged in doing these emotionally charged mind melds. But the difference is that we are not Vulcans. Well, nobody is really a Vulcan. A Vulcan is a fictional entity. We are not purely rationally based beings. We are emotionally based beings. And the connections that I have with somebody are not the same as the connections that a Vulcan like Mr. Spock would have, where basically he has to literally transform his own personality, get rid temporarily of his rational, logical state, and get into an emotional condition. Well, that's not something that we really have to worry about. All of us, to one extent or another, are already emotional. So we don't have to start from the bottom up. We already know how to be emotional. We already know how to connect with another person. That's a part of human nature. It's something that we all should have some basic facility in doing. So, after we bracket the non-essential parts of that individual, the personality, the appearance, the clothing, the property, the socioeconomic status, anything that is superficial to who that person really is. You take out all the externals and you only leave that little gem which matters. And that gem is what is explored through the process of intersubjectivity. So through intersubjectivity, one attempts to actually connect emotionally and through insight with that person. That is something that most of us do not generally do. At least with me, at least when I was younger, especially, my conversations with people as an autistic guy were generally very rational. In fact, I would very rarely even pay attention to the person I was speaking with. It's like I was talking at them, not talking with them. I would already have in my mind what I wanted to say to them. So there was really nothing surprising to me in what I said. I basically ignored how the other person was responding, whether they even cared about what I was saying, and I simply went on talking and rambling and saying all sorts of things which the person probably could care less about. Well, that's not intersubjectivity. With intersubjectivity, we deeply and passionately connect with that other person. We try to find a way of relating to that person on the level of the heart, on the level of intuition, so that when I am talking to that person, I am literally talking to that person's inner or higher self. Okay, now, having given that very basic, superficial summary of Edmund Husserl's approach to phenomenology, how can I relate that to Maoism, third worldism? Well, basically, I think that when I meet somebody from a very different cultural background, I am not from the third world. I was born and raised in New York City. I've lived around the country. I've lived in Georgia twice. I've lived in Virginia once. I've lived in Mississippi once. And I lived in Kansas once. That was my longest stay, which was for a period of 30 years. I've only been here in the Rio Grande Valley of Texas for just over a year. So this place is still kind of a new territory for me. I'm still learning about it every day, trying to take more of it in, to explore it and to understand it. When I travel over to Mexico, I am meeting people who are very different than myself. Or even when I speak with people who live right here in Hidalgo County in deep South Texas, the part of Texas which is literally right on the Mexican border, in the Rio Grande Valley, like me personally, 3 miles north of Mexico. That is really close. Really, really close. I can be there in just a couple of minutes if I wanted to and cross over the border, and there's a large medical center on the right-hand side. Regardless, when I meet somebody, even somebody from here in Hidalgo County, many people here are nothing like me, the so-called Anglos, and I would fit in that category myself, not because I'm English, but because my native language is English. When I meet people whose native language is Spanish, I am typically meeting somebody from a very different culture or subculture than my own. The odd thing is that even when you compare Mexican Americans with Mexicans living right across the border, the language is not the same. I recently went to a community meeting of all the owners of the condos here in the complex where I live. And what amazed me was that although I couldn't understand, because I unfortunately do not know Spanish, which is one of the great regrets of my life, because I obviously had no idea I would end up living here. But when I was there, I found out that there is a significant difference between Spanish as it is spoken here in the Rio Grande Valley of Texas and Spanish as it is spoken in the Rio Grande Valley of Mexico. In other words, there is the Tex-Mex Spanish and there is the Mexican Spanish. Very, very different. And when people who speak those two varieties of Spanish, even though they're right next door to each other, they often have a very difficult time understanding each other. So I'm realizing all of these different variations. The longer I'm here, the more I realize and recognize the diversity of all the people around me. Unfortunately, I really can't speak with somebody who only knows Spanish unless I have a translator. The good thing is that most people, though not all, most people here who speak Spanish also speak some English, some a lot, some only a tiny bit. But I can usually get by, and I have learned enough basic Spanish. And when I say basic, I mean basic, so that we can have a basic conversation. Often our conversation is on our cell phones. We each go to Google Translate and we translate each other's expressions. And we can take a while, but we can eventually communicate with each other. So, in other words, I have bracketed all the external things about that person, the things that don't matter. The fact that that person is Mexican, or the fact that that person is Mexican American, or how that person looks, or how that person talks, or how that person thinks, or how that person dresses, or what kind of a home that person lives in. And I can simply address the heart and the insight of that person. That is my goal whenever I am engaged in bracketing and intersubjectivity. This has been Mark for Mark A. Foster, Ph.D. Have a pleasant evening and an even better day tomorrow.